Peter's photos that we've picked up along the way.
That's Peter in middle school, about 1967.
His correspondence, this is sort of a major area of our research. Peter wrote numerous letters, sometimes by hand, more often than not typewritten. Fortunately, recipients have saved a number of those, and we were able to acquire those. I think we acquired another one last week, the subject of which was Mr. Craig Bell. It was Peter's defense of Craig when he joined Rocket from the Tombs, because apparently Craig was not allowed to quit the Mirrors or leave the Mirrors to join Rocket from the Tombs, but he did anyways. Some members of the Mirrors were upset about that. Peter wrote a letter to the Mirrors defending that decision. But the letters, the reason why they're really important to our research is that they provide an insight, Peter's mindset regarding the things that he and Charlotte and the Black Orchid Society are up to. He really gets into what he was thinking, what he's planning, what he's doing.
Or even just what he's playing on the stereo.
Yeah, exactly. And also it sort of points again to a pre-internet time and how information was distributed around. They used to send telegraphs to each other, something that...
That's the only way you get Ella Travis Dobbs. I mean, we think, because we don't have Peter's voice, except, I can't call him on the phone and say, all right, so when you said this to Jamie in this letter, what did you mean? I mean, I can't ask him that. But, between the writings, his reviews, his writings, the radio sequences where he's talking between songs on stage, and even the letters, you get to form more of a picture of his actual voice and thought process. Because that's, in the absence of him being with us to answer questions, that's the best you can do.
I'm going to move quickly through some slides here. Here's some photos that we've collected up. Interviews are another major area of our research. Many of Peter's friends and collaborators are still alive, still with us. We've taken the time to reach as many of them as we could to basically collect their story, collect their oral history of what happened. And I don't know how many we've done, but we've done numerous.
We're still doing them.
And we're still doing them all the time.
And as you pointed out, with every person you talk to, they go, hey, did you talk to, or have you found, or do you know? And so it keeps extending the people you need to speak to who were there, witnessed it. One thing we're always looking for is people who saw Peter play in any capacity. Because there's not a lot of people who weren't friends with him who saw him play that we've spoken to. Although, for example, in the time he was in the Mr. Stress Blues Band, he played close to 60 shows with them. Would love to speak to someone who said, oh yeah, I saw those guys at the Brick Cottage, but it's just a continuing voices adding to the project, adding to the picture.
So one other thing too about interviews is now I've heard twice from people that I've interviewed that I'm glad you called me. I've been waiting 30 years for someone to call me and ask me about Peter Lochner. And when you hear stuff like that, you're on the right track. And we're so pleased to be able to find these people and do these things. So why are we saving this stuff? Well, first of all, we ask ourselves the question, why is this work relevant? And because we have this big pile of things that we've saved up, does it really mean anything? I think there's maybe a bit of a dichotomy sometimes in my mind, maybe a tension between the idea that maybe we don't need, as researchers, need to answer that question. The public can decide what's important. And we're in a time right now when the public, the music listening public, is greatly interested in archival and retrospective releases, especially from the 70s. In my mind, I think people that are interested in this stuff find these sort of archival projects authentic and original, and are looking for sort of original expression, and naturally are drawn to that. But again, that's just my theory.
Well, the influence continues to spin out of it as well. I mean, the reverberations of this time in American cultural musical history, if you will, and relevance is still being felt today. It's still important. People are still buying records by the Dead Boys. People are still wanting to hear Peter's material, clamoring for it even. And it's still influencing people who were, would be the grandchildren of the people who made this music.
Right, and I don't want to run away from the question by just saying, well, maybe the question isn't ours to decide. I think in our minds, we also have to answer the question. That's sort of the dichotomy that I have in my mind between answering and not answering. And we've developed some answers. As Nick said, we're archiving the Cleveland contribution maybe to a larger cultural movement in the United States. There's things that are happening on a much larger scale outside of Cleveland and in Cleveland regarding sort of the promise and failure of the American suburban dream. And certainly Peter and Charlotte were part of that. They grew up in the suburbs and moved to the city. And I think there was an interview that I'd like to mention that was really interesting. I think it was either with Charlotte or Cynthia Black, in which they said they really had to do this out of necessity because they were sitting around for so many years waiting for the impending nuclear disaster that everyone was promised in the late 60s, and when it didn't happen, they figured they needed to do something, and this was something that they did. The work is also relevant, we think, because it really is part of sort of continuum of artistic expression in Cleveland. We stretch it all the way back to a monster movie host, as crazy as that sounds, by the name of Gilardi, who was one of the first monster movie hosts on television. He was sort of this, not sort of, he was a kind of beatnik, bohemian, deadpan humorist with Eastern European flair and with a sarcasm. Lots of fireworks and a sarcasm that was thick as butter, or maybe a kishka, I should say, and but also whose satire was very nuanced. And very little of his broadcasts from the 50s survive, but everyone who did see it, who was part of this scene, was incredibly influenced by it, including David Thomas, who cites Gilardi as a major influence upon his art. The other thing about Gilardi, too, is it presents sort of a conundrum to us, because at the time it aired, it was impossible to know that that was really important and relevant until many years later. And so when we look at the work that we're collecting, we sort of have that same sort of conundrum. Is it important and is it relevant years later after the fact?
But Gilardi is also someone, much like we were saying about Rocket from the Tombs, or a few other Peter's acts, who there were broadcasts that survived and circulated on bootleg for years, and recently one particular archivist has gathered together all of the bootleg performances and put them together for viewing. And this stuff existed and survived in the bootleg circuit to be shared as sort of a, I don't want to go on and say celebration of junk culture so much, but it does play into that to some extent, but also beat culture, which was also heavily influenced by the nuclear bomb droppings on Nagasaki and Hiroshima and state of the world after that and the mindset. This all starts to form a more of a relevant picture, if you will.
One other thing that interests me, and this is something that I've talked to Charlotte Pressler about, it's really part of her work more than it's part of mine, but I'm interested in knowing how geography of a place and architecture of a place impacts a scene and impacts the artistic development and artistic expression in that particular scene. And so I've focused my attention on the Plaza, which we've mentioned before, as a sort of idea incubator. And
well, I think another thing David cites is they would play they'd be playing the Pirates Cove, and they take a break between the shows, and they walk out in the street and look over across the harbor and see the aeronautical shot feeding factory and blast some flames out of the.
It was a grim environment.
Yeah,
A very grim environment.
So one other thing that we've tried to do with our research is correct errors in print. We had a previous slide regarding some fanzines that were published after Peter's death. Some of those contain errors and misrepresentations, outright fabrications. One I would like to, there's a number of them that we could discuss, but because of our time constraints, really I would like to just point out one. let's talk about the Peter's death just briefly. It was published by Clinton Halen in his book about the band Joy Division that Peter had committed suicide, and we know from letters that we've collected, we know from interviews that we've done that that is completely untrue. He was, at the end of his life, as we had mentioned before, suffering from severe addiction to both drugs and alcohol. But what we did find through his letters that we were able to collect, that he was attempting to seek help for himself. He was, in fact, making plans to leave Cleveland at the time of his death, and he thought that that would be a way for him to leave his addictions behind. Unfortunately, it didn't happen, and he perished at his parents' house from acute pancreatitis, as we had mentioned before.
If I may. Also,
Yes.
I also say there's a line here about Eric Ritz was never in fiction. Well, when I wrote this, this is the conclusion we reached, and that has now since changed in the last week because someone who was politely declining to speak to us suddenly emailed me and said, Eric Ritz is no longer alive, but the other drummer in fiction, Anton Fear, some of whom you probably know from bands like the Feelies, was also in that band.
One of the people went to New York.
Yeah, and he was also in the Lounge Lizards, and he wrote and said, hey, by the way, I never answered your question, so let me. So it's now, we're coming to re-examine this, but that's part of the thing is, people will say he was never in that band, and somebody else will say, you know what, I think he did fill in for me. So these things do change. If I strike that from the record, I'll take the beating on it.
So my record label, Smog Veil Records, that I founded with my wife Lisa nearly 25 years ago. We have a mission, and that's why we're doing this Peter Lochner work. But our mission is to make available unknown, unheard, and underappreciated music, bombastic music from Cleveland, Ohio. We like to celebrate obscurity, and as I had mentioned before, the listening public equates obscurity with something that is authentic and real, and that really resonates.
We would hope so.
Yes, absolutely. Time is running out, though, for our work. Tapes are decaying. There are a number of issues regarding digital transfers, file formats, printed media is decaying. People that we want to interview are unfortunately dying now and then. And we are basically running as fast as we can in order to find as many people as we can and get their story.
Sometimes you'll be on the path of looking for someone. I was looking for a guy named Don Farmer who played in the Mr. Stress Blues Band in the late 71 with Peter. And I was searching and searching, and I finally found someone who met him and said, I hate to tell you this, he died 3 years ago. But, you know, it's sometimes you do get to talk to people before they die. And we did all speak to Tim Wright. He's a personal friend of all three of us, but we never did a proper interview, unfortunately.
So how do we do it? Well, as I said, we have our own collections of things that we've contributed to this project. We've gone out and searched for people. We've basically done detective work. We've gone to academic libraries. We've searched other people's archives. We've used the internet.
Well, I was thinking too, there are archives, specifically like rare book rooms or formal archives. The Western Reserve Historical Society has an archive with some information in it.
Sometimes information turns up in places we don't expect it to.
Yep. We generally make just a couple technical matters. We generally make PDF copies of printed things that we find. We share them amongst ourselves. We have a cloud-based password-protected system where we house everything that's searchable and allows us to add comments to the stuff that we've collected. There are some issues, though, with printed matter that I'd like to point out that Andrew has discovered, especially regards microfilm. Microfilm is only as good as the person who creates the microfilm. So you can see on the left there.
That's from the Plain Dealer Historical Database, which is really a wonderful resource because they essentially digitized all this microfilm and made it searchable. So you can search for Peter Lochner and maybe that will turn up. Now, yes, there's this big overexposed area in the middle of the page. Fortunately, I circled in red the two parts that are relevant to our our research. So in that case, we lucked out.
As far as we
Yeah.
know, there
Yeah.
could be a
There
mirror's
could be
gig,
something there in the middle.
like a mirror's gig or a Sheffield
Yeah.
brush gig I'm looking for buried in there.
But
somewhere.
besides
Well,
over,
probably not, 'cause
yeah,
it's like 70, well,
Bes-
maybe mirrors.
It doesn't matter.
yeah. Besides overexposure errors, there's margins get cut off to the left or
'cause
right
you
or
got
top or
bad
bottom.
printers that weren't maintained, or just bad films. I think this is from John Carroll University. It says full concert tonight. That's at very short notice. I was able to kind of fit that between the area of the screen that worked and the part of the page that would print. I was able to get that printed out. That picture with all the streaks in it, that's DNA with Tim Wright from Interview Magazine, but it's, you can see the quality of the reproduction there. And up at the top is another one of Peter's ads, and it's just, if you blow that up too much, it becomes, very highly illegible. And that's kind of the point there. There's all these.
So one thing I'd like to point out too, when it comes to searching academic libraries, archives, and special collections, that oftentimes those institutions place restrictions upon what you can use, what you can quote, what you can copy, what you can freely disseminate or sell to the public. That's a challenge to us now and then. Fortunately, the places that we've gone to search understand what we're doing and have provided us with the proper licenses and permissions that we need to use the material. I want to provide an example, though, of a search that I did recently at Case Western Reserve University, where Peter had applied to go to college. I was able to, through their various departments, but with a lot of convincing, get a copy of his 7-page handwritten essay that he attached to his college application. It was very insightful. But something like that, that particular university placed restrictions upon it on how we can use it. I can certainly quote it any time. I'm not permitted to copy it in whole or disseminate it in that manner. And you should be aware. You should be aware, if you're doing work like this, of what the various restrictions that those institutions impose upon the things that you might be looking for.
They were concerned with the student information getting out. With some of these other cases, it's more like, they have a set of papers from somebody who donated them, and they're more worried about, maybe the donor doesn't want something republished. They're willing to let you look at it, but they don't, you have to get permission from the copyright holder, and then also they may want a fee to, if you want to quote from it or reproduce part of it, they may want a fee to help cover their expenses for keeping these things.
So I want to move quickly in this last section because I want to take some questions here. But what do we do with all this? We have a big
stack of photocopies for my library research there.
We have a big pile of stuff, and what are we going to do? Well, I suppose we could write a book, and it would be interesting, and we certainly have enough material to do that, although I would like to add some additional material to it as our research is ongoing. But what we ultimately would like to do is release some records of both Peter and Charlotte and other members of the Black Orchid Society and their numerous recordings. But that isn't always easy to do because we have to find the rights holders, the license holders, and acquire a license from them, and sometimes that's not so hard to do, but sometimes it's very difficult to do, and it can be very expensive to do, and it's an ongoing effort on my part. I work as an attorney. That's basically my work as an attorney, is to negotiate licenses for musical compositions and then release them on a record label, and that effort with regard to the Peter Lochner Archives and the Black Orchid Society is ongoing. We have not yet acquired the necessary licenses to make releases of Peter's work, but we have discussions with his estate and his rights holders nearly every week. And I hope at some point, I don't know if it will be this year, but I do hope at some point to be able to announce that we will be releasing material, but we're not ready to do so. Even if we were able to acquire a license today, I don't know that we are ready to start releasing recorded material, because the three of us do believe there's still a tremendous amount of research that needs to be done, and we want to present this in such a manner that it honors the people that are involved with this.
And not just Peter, but everybody else who played on these recordings.
Yeah, because he's a collaborator, really.
Yeah. So basically, the three of us collaborate through the internet. That's how we do it. We talked about some of the search tips we use. Misspellings, make sure you always if you're doing this type of work, consider misspellings. It's amazing what we found that way.